Welcome to the Criminologist Podcast. Our goal here is to educate and enlighten our listeners, focusing on the latest and greatest evidence-based interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. And not only those factors which drive folks into crime, we also look at the reasons why people exit a life of crime. Also, we attempt to paint an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those involved in the system are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality. This podcast will avoid stereotypes and biases. We will endeavor to accomplish the first two goals in a way that keep you, the listener, interested and even entertained. And now, the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 28 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Last week, I mentioned that I would be bringing you a special Halloween episode, and so I'm taking a break from our clientele and our subject matter experts to take a look at some traditional monsters in honor of Halloween. I know it's the first week in November, but the internet is forever, which is to say, technically, it's not Halloween. I know some of you download and listen right away. Some of you listen weeks later, so we're going to just go for it and dub this our Halloween episode. I'm going to have some fun with the assessment process and also may take a stab, excuse the pun, at some case planning with these Fright Night staples. And so today we're going to look at two of my classic monster movie favorites, Frankenstein and the Wolfman. Now, if you're new to the show, or it's been a while since I mentioned it, just by way of background, I am a trainer of a couple of different assessment tools in desistance world. I can train you all on the DRAER, the dynamic risk assessment for offender reentry. That is Dr. Sarin's tool designed to measure desistance correlates. And over in the risk need responsivity camp, I'm a master trainer of the LSCMI, the Level of Service Case Management Inventory, which is a staple around the world for those of you who embrace the risk needs responsivity model. So with this Halloween episode, I'm just really trying to A, have some fun, and B, take some of the mystery out of the assessment process and really just get folks to better understand the principles of risk, need, responsivity. Now, of course, with these characters, I'm in no way suggesting that an accurate risk assessment can be done in the fashion that I'm about to model for you here. Rather, I'm really just trying to use this as a means to demonstrate to the larger audience and to the layperson what criminogenic need looks like. That being said, let's see what could be interpreted as a risk factor for the creature, Frankenstein's monster. And before diving into his criminogenic risk assessments, I should point out that there are a variety of risk assessments in use today, which examine criminogenic factors, but they all look at criminogenic need as outlined in The Psychology of Criminal Conduct by Bonta and Andrews. I'm going to leave a link to that book in the show description of this episode. It really is a must read if you listen to this podcast. And to recap, if you're new to the show or unfamiliar with those areas often referred to as the Central 8 are 8 categories or domains which have proven to be the strongest correlates to criminality. And those are, again, briefly, and we'll look at this via the assessments, but they are criminal history, a lack of achievement in the areas of education and employment, examining whether there are areas of strife in an individual's family and marital relationships, if there's a void with positive activities in an individual's life, and by activity I mean recreational type activities. Of course, we examine companions, which is a strong correlate to criminality. Traditional stuff as well, like alcohol and drug problems. And then finally, it really boils down to their antisocial cognitions, their thinking. So we look at their pro-criminal attitude and also an antisocial pattern of behaving. I would encourage you also to check out my YouTube video entitled Criminogenic Needs Explained. I also have one out entitled Risk Needs Responsivity Meets Desistance, which sounds kind of like a classic horror movie, actually. Frankenstein meets the werewolf. Again, a link to those YouTube videos from my channel, The Criminologist, can be found in the show notes, the description of this episode. So let's start off with the creature, the monster, more to the point, Frankenstein's monster.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Let's begin then with that first category or domain, that of criminal history. Here we look at a variety of factors, not just if there are any indications of a criminal history, but also if there are multiple scrapes with the law in the client's past. We're really looking at the depth and breadth of delinquency in the past because, again, we know the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. We see here that our client, the creature, does have a bit of criminality in his past. Now, we don't have a case file to review per se, but if we rely on the 1931 classic movie Frankenstein, recall the scene where the creature is down at the river, he encounters the little girl, they're throwing flowers into the river, having a good time, and Frankenstein mistakenly thinks that the little girl's going to float just like the flowers floated in the river.
No, you're hurting me! No!
And in addition to that episode, in the 1931 film, he kills two other people. He frames another, sending her to her death, and, of course, drives Victor Frankenstein insane. If we assume that the creature has never been placed on supervision or been incarcerated, safe to say that about half of the items in that section would be scored as risk. Although I must say I did struggle trying to determine the age at first offense. Technically, the monster was not yet a teenager by the time he committed his first offense, correct? If we look at this chronologically. But I digress. Now, taking a look at the next area, education/employment. Well, the creature's never been employed and is currently unemployed. Clearly no formal education, so plenty of areas of risk there as well. In fact, the majority of those items would be assessed as risk, in my opinion. Plenty of case plan fodder around education and employment for his supervising agent. Next, let's examine the realm of family and marital status. If you're unfamiliar with risk assessments, you should know that one item we measure here is the client's satisfaction around their marital status or equivalent status. The trick, though, is in scoring the clients who are single. That's where it gets kind of tricky. If your client is content and happy being single, then that is scored as not a risk. But if they are unhappy being single, for example, lonely and just really longing to find someone, then that's deemed to be a risk factor. Now, with Frankenstein's monster, I recall a nasty breakup with the bride of Frankenstein. Things did not go too smoothly, so I'm going to go ahead and score that as a risk on that item. Other areas in this section look at the client's relationship with their parents. In this case, Victor Frankenstein, I guess. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and score that as risk as well. Finally, we look at whether or not the client's family have themselves engaged in any criminal behavior. And again, this gets back to modeled behavior. With Dr. Frankenstein's grave robbing and other questionable medical antics, I'm going to go ahead and score that a big yes for the doctor and score that as risk. So next, we look at whether or not the client has positive, pro-social, recreational, or leisure activities going on in their life. And again, back to the theory here, we're really looking for some pro-social modeling to be taking place. I'm just going to go ahead and make the call here that no, the creature has a lack of pro-social, recreational, leisure activities in his life. He's not playing in an intramural softball league or a member of the Knights of Columbus, in good standing with the Freemasons, that kind of thing. Now, an area of criminogenic need, which is right at the top, companions. Here we're looking at two things. Are there risky friends and associates in the client's life which model antisocial behavior? But also, are there pro-social folks in the client's life modeling positive behavior who, in effect, buffer against risk? As to criminal friends and acquaintances, now, if we're faithful to the novel, loneliness was a major theme. So the creature would be seen as a social isolate. I'm going to cut him a little bit of slack here, though, and score the blind man who befriends him as at least an acquaintance, pro-social acquaintance. So not all risk in that area. Okay, next, let's look at some of the more traditional criminogenic variables, that of alcohol and drugs. I gotta say, the big green guy is going to do well here. No history or current use of alcohol or drugs, so a big win for the creature there. More to the point, from a case planning aspect, that could be a foundation of strength from which to build. Heading into the home stretch here now, let's look at the creature's attitudes and thinking patterns. What do we think here, folks? Is the monster's orientation pro-criminal, supportive of delinquency? Here we look at clients' values, beliefs, and cognitive emotional state. That is, do we see rage and anger? I gotta say, yeah. When push comes to shove at the end of the day, I'm thinking some risky thinking going on here. Despite his moments of being contemplative, overall, I'm thinking risk here. Now, as noted, we're having some fun and taking certain liberties. Normally, we would assess how the client feels about their supervision status, being on probation and parole, that is, their criminal sentencing, how they feel about that, that type of thing. But can't really say that here without speculating too much. Okay, so if I unofficially tally all these up, again, we use different risks assessments out there, but he's hitting on a majority of variables in the tool. So he would come across, be scored rather, as a high-risk client. As to case planning, of course, we're going to advocate for some cognitive behavioral interventions. We would attack the risk in areas of education and employment by the traditional route of educational pursuits, vocational training. As noted, no issues with chemical dependency. As to family, his quote-unquote father, Victor Frankenstein, dies in the novel at least aboard Captain Walton's ship. Otherwise, no real family to mend here. Now, we had Jane Mulcahy on the show last week, and she gave us an awesome lesson in the role of trauma in the change process. What are your thoughts, listeners? How can we apply some trauma-informed approaches here? Again, in the novel, and even in the film, we see themes of rejection, isolation, abandonment, the pain of his physical abnormalities. So yeah, lots of trauma to unpack and address here. And as Jane noted last week, work to do with building back positive relationships. Now, what about the question of desistance from crime? How could we augment the creature's social capital, his human capital, and of course, his identity transformation. And also, what would the rewriting of scripts look like? We have noted how, and again, more so with Mary Shelley's novel, there are themes of rejection and isolation and abandonment. What then would the creature's scripts look like? That is, what self-narratives does he have? And how could we go about changing those to a redemption script? Now, as noted, I've been having some fun with this special Halloween episode, but it does beg the question, at least to a degree, how close to the mark, sadly, is my fun little monster movie illustration to real life? That is, as ludicrous as it may have sounded to some of you contemplating questions around augmenting the creature's social capital, human capital, and identity transformation. Again, I wonder how close that may be with folks in society feeling that it's ludicrous that we pose those same questions in an effort to help justice-involved individuals. Again, we are living in some extremely divided times, very partisan. It's very us versus them with justice-involved individuals. I'm just wondering if that's a true life lesson that we can all reflect on.
A quick break from the show to give a shout out to our friends at APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. APHIS is a professional organization dedicated to uniting the forensic communities of criminal justice, education, law, medicine, and psychology. APHIS is a leader in building relationships within the forensic community, locally and nationally. The mission of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies is to provide quality education, training, consultation, and research in the forensic studies to professionals and students. APHIS is a leader in connecting members with one another to help facilitate professional growth, increased competency, and awareness in forensic mental health studies. For details as to upcoming training events, webinars, or publications, please visit them at www.aiafs.com. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back. So let's take a look at another client, again, celebrating the Halloween season with the Wolfman. Okay, once again, let's begin by taking a look at the criminal history section. Again, we're going to take some liberties here. One could make a fairly strong argument that, at a minimum, the Wolfman has killed several individuals. It depends on which iteration of the story we go with, though. I know that in the 1941 film, The Wolfman, starring the great Lon Chaney Jr., which I grew up watching with my brothers, in that film, he killed at least the local gravedigger, which is the clip you just heard. But depending, again, on what version of the Wolfman you grew up watching, we could have some variance here with the criminal history. I would just ask that you recall criminal history is a static variable. It's not dynamic like our other domains or sections. And really, our biggest bang for the buck with criminal history comes again from that axiom that our best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Although with the Wolfman, I guess we could predict his behavior based on lunar cycles. Wah, wah. Sorry, I use humor as a coping mechanism. So let's take a dive at the Wolfman's education and employment. Again, taking some liberties depending on which Wolfman character we're actually assessing, but I would say the character of Lawrence Talbot, who was, again, Lon Chaney's character in the film, had some decent human capital as to education and employment. So I'm going to go low here. Pretty pro-social, at least when he's in human form. What about his family marital relationships? Again, in the 1941 Lon Chaney film, Larry Talbot returns home after receiving word that his brother has died in an unfortunate hunting accident. That reflects a closeness with his sibling. He does reunite with his formerly estranged father. He does ask the character of Gwen out on a date, although she does turn him down. Still, I'm not seeing a lot of risk in this area to a great degree. As to how he spends his downtime, when we look at that leisure and recreational category, I guess he could use some structured pro-social activity in his life, so we can sprinkle in some risk here. As to companions, somewhat of a social isolate, I would say. On the one hand, there's not a dearth of antisocial friends, but on the other hand, not many pro-social friends and acquaintances either. And again, recall, this is all about social learning theory. What is the modeled behavior of the individuals that the client has in their life? Are they modeling delinquent criminal behavior, more to the point, the cost and rewards of that behavior? Or are they modeling pro-social behavior, more to the point, the cost and rewards of that pro-social behavior? That's really the root cause of why we look at that area of companions. Alcohol, drug, no risk that I can see here for the Wolfman, although perhaps we can again take some liberties. In the film, the old gypsy woman reads a poem to Lawrence Talbot, and that poem says, "Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright." So again, taking liberties here, we see a pretty pro-social Lawrence Talbot, other than during a full moon, if you will. So again, having fun here, I was kind of thinking this might be an analogy with clients who are otherwise pro-social yet struggle with addiction. Now, I know Dr. Bonta would say alcohol and drug are not a major correlate to crime, and that is true. But again, I'm just trying to have some fun here about why this character, who is otherwise pretty pro-social in these other areas, behaves criminally. So I was trying to make the analogy of the full moon being like when he relapses with drugs or alcohol. Now, of course, as we noted, alcohol and drugs are not a huge correlate to crime. And even if you do have a client who struggles with addiction, we know that the best way to get at that is through a cognitive-based substance abuse treatment or program, which is a great segue to this final area here. Those last two domains of pro-criminal attitude and antisocial personality pattern. And again, just using the analogy of the curse of the Wolfman as an addiction or something that triggers his criminality. Again, he's by most accounts pretty pro-social, other than during the full moon when he becomes ravenously antisocial. I know mental illness is not considered criminogenic, but again, looking at this through the lens of how deviancy is interpreted in society, we see how swift their reaction is, right? You hear the townspeople freaking out and assigning, this violence to all sorts of superstition and lore. The Wolfman is remorseful, and he's not wanting to reoffend. He frantically searches for a cure to his ailment. This is really a tale of impulsivity, the alpha male, our primal self. He gives up his identity for passions. The other big takeaway I wanted to note here is that offense severity does not drive the risk of reoffending. This is a major mistake we see with not just practitioners, but even administrators. So you could have a pretty horrific offense, the killing of the grave digger, for example. And if we say that was his only offense, we should not base the probability of reoffending on the severity of the underlying crime. We see that in society. We see that with practitioners. And again, we even see that with administrators who have all these crazy overrides. They override a risk assessment just based on the severity of the offense. So that is not a good thing to do, people. And in the case of the Wolfman, we shouldn't do that either. Hey, I hope you had fun with this episode. If you want to learn a little bit more about this content, I encourage you to visit my YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Specifically, watch the videos Criminogenic Needs Explained and also the video Risk Needs Responsivity Meets Desistance. If you have any questions of me, you can contact the show through the Criminologist Podcast at gmail.com. That's the Criminologist Podcast at gmail.com. Remember to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're having a lot of fun with our Instagram and Facebook feeds, and those are at the Criminologist Podcast. Instagram at the Criminologist Podcast, and our Facebook page, the Criminologist Podcast. You don't want to miss out on the fun we're having with that. You can also connect with me directly, Joseph Arvidsson, via LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. And I've alluded to the YouTube channel. If you have not yet done so, please subscribe. If you're watching a video and you like what you see, give a thumbs up. Coffee mugs are available. If you want some merch, reach out to the show. And always remember, folks, there's no them. There's only us.
Your suffering is over. Now you will find peace for eternity.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, training opportunities, or to contact the host, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Click on the Contact Us tab in the upper right-hand side of the page. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.